Today, you will learn positional chess. Let's go. This video was suggested by Mukesh, so thank you very much for the suggestion. If you would like to be in my next video suggesting the topic, if you'd like to see any chess concept explained in very simple terms, feel free to drop a comment down below and I'll add it to my list of videos. For now, let's get started with as many positional ideas as we can in one video. Positional play in chess is an extremely broad topic that it's simply impossible to cover in a 5-hour video, let alone a 10-minute one, but I'll do my best to explain the following 3 things. Number 1, weak squares, how to create them and how to use them. Number 2, pawn weaknesses, how to create them, how to use them. And number 3, piece activity. What makes pieces good, what makes them bad, how can we use this to gain an advantage? We're going to start with weak squares. First of all, what is a weak square, also commonly referred to as an outpost? It's basically a square which our pawns can defend, but theirs can never attack because they have either gone too far or the pawns just don't exist. So this b5 square would be a so-called weak square or an outpost. Why is this square important? Because if we are able to get a piece there, it's going to be there for a long time in a defended position. So it's going to put a lot of pressure on our opponent. How are weak squares created? Well, just by changing the pawn structure, because weak squares depend purely on where our pawns are. So in this case, we could play the move pawn to f5, and this would create another outpost square. So again, a square defended by our pawns that can never be attacked by theirs, because theirs have gone too far or just don't exist anymore. How can we use weak squares to improve our chess? We basically now have a square where our pieces belong. So here on the next moves, we're going to play knight to f4 and knight to e6 and have this monster of a knight which can never get chased away. And from this safeguarded position, it will constantly be pressuring the opponent's position. Here's a game example from a famous game. This is George Allen Thomas playing with the white pieces and Alexander Alekhine playing with the black pieces. Both tremendously good players. And black has obtained an advantage here by using some of the weak squares to place his pieces on. So firstly, he goes b5 over here to make sure that the c4 and a4 squares become outposts or weak squares. And watch what happens here after queen to d1, just rook to c4. It's not very often that your rook can just swing so far forward, but the reason it can is because these are technically outpost squares. Once again, defended by our pawns, can never be attacked by theirs because they do not have a b2 or b3 pawn. Even if there was a white pawn on b4, these two would still be outposts because, again, the pawn must be either overextended, not to be able to come back and cover these squares, or just missing, as is the case here. As a result of this great control over these light squares, black had 3 outposts to work with and just maneuver his pieces around until white's defense just cracked. I'm going to quickly scroll through the game, but notice how black's pieces move. Completely freely uncontested until white trades queens very soon. There we go. And now, because we have access to these very strong squares, we're able to attack these weaknesses, which we're going to speak about soon. These pawn weaknesses are just absolute targets for us. So notice how black, before continuing any immediate action with captures or something, just tends to reroute nice and slow, gets the king in the game, freely goes between these squares anytime he wants, and puts immense pressure on these weaknesses. Soon after, black just broke through and won the game. This is the essence of positional chess. Sometimes chess is not all about, I hang a rook, but my opponent hung a queen, so it's fine. It's the small grind of positional advantages. So here, it could be something as small as taking a square or two and using that to much easier reroute your pieces to much better squares to gain another type of advantage, piece activity, to then slowly win a pawn, perhaps, and then trade down to winning endgame. Very, very small incremental steps to victory. Now that we've talked about weak squares, let's dive into weak pawns. What makes a pawn weak? There are essentially 3 types of pawn weaknesses that you must know about. The first one is an isolated pawn. An isolated pawn is a pawn that has no friendly pawns on the adjacent files. So this d4 pawn of white is a weakness. The second type of weakness is what's known as doubled pawns. So here we have, as white, two doubled pawns. Doubled pawns are simply two pawns that are on the same file. The reason they are weak is because pawns capture, so they attack and defend diagonally. So these two can never defend each other. They constantly must be defended by other pieces, and that's what makes them weak and subject to attack. And the third type of weakness in chess is something known as a backwards pawn. Here, the d6 pawn is the one that we're looking at. It's a pawn which cannot be protected by a friendly pawn, and anytime it moves up, it simply gets captured. So that will be this one. This would be the third type of weakness. How do we take advantage of pawn weaknesses? For all three types, it's the same two patterns. Either, number one, you attack the weakness directly with your pieces, so that will be moves along the lines of knight c3 to go knight b5, put pressure here, or b3 to go bishop a3, so put as many attackers on that pawn as possible. That will be the first one. The second way to take advantage of a weakness is by blocking it with your pieces. So using the square in front of the weakness as an outpost for your pieces. So weak squares or outposts and weak pawns tend to be connected very, very often. Let's see the same two ways to use a weakness in the other examples that we've seen so far. So in the example of the doubled pawn, the way black tries to take advantage of this is either by attacking the pawns directly or using the square in front of the pawns as a weak square, so for his pieces. In this particular case, it seems like the knights have a much easier access to the square in front as opposed to attacking it. Sometimes one of the ways will be available, sometimes the other. Sometimes both are fine. So in this case, I expect black to try and take the outpost immediately with one of their knights. I just want to show you how this usually plays out. So currently it's white to move. They are also going to see this, and they're going to play knight c3 with the idea of meeting knight h5 with knight e2. Because now, if black takes the outpost immediately, we can just trade it off, and now the pawn structure has changed. Now this is no longer an outpost square because it's occupied by a pawn. And if white plays d4 here, they are doing very, very well. For that reason, in this position, black will not go knight f4, but they will try to get the other knight here as well. The way they do that is by rerouting knight f8, and then to one of these squares, and then to f4. So let's say white tries to stop black by covering this square, black just goes to the other one, and whichever knight is attacked, that knight will come here. So for example, bishop to g4, but now black wins the battle of the outpost by getting this knight here. If white takes, black just recaptures, and the outpost has worked in black's favor. Black now has an advantage. And the same thing applied in the isolated pawn scenario. So the same way, we use the square in front for our pieces. By accident, we have already conquered it. And now it's time to turn our attention to the pawn instead. So of course, white is going to try and defend this to the best of their ability, and we just have to add all the pieces to the attack, as we mentioned. And now rook fd1 protects it. We cannot take it immediately, because if we take, they take with the rook, our queen is in front of our rook, and we don't want to give up our queen just to take that pawn. So for that reason, we have to utilize the pin over here to just make the e5 pawn break work. And now, should white take, they would lose a rook. Take, 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 and take. And at the end, black is just winning. So for that reason, they cannot take this pawn, they have to lose this pawn. Now, pawn takes pawn is our move no matter what. Or maybe rook takes. So our knowledge of weaknesses and positional play has allowed us to peacefully take advantage of this and turn our positional advantage into a material one, utilizing a little bit of tactics as well. How are pawn weaknesses created? Well, again, by changes of the pawn structure. So similar as weak squares, weak pawns are also decided by changes in the pawn structure. So we could see a typical opening here after e4, c5. Let's say c4, d6. This is a way for black to make a mistake. So now in this position, black played pawn to e5. It wasn't a forced move by any means. Knight to c6 was much better, but black has chosen the move e5, and white can simply go back and say, oh, with this move, you have given yourself the backwards pawn that we mentioned, and d5 is now an outpost square. So now we can strategically adjust our development based on taking advantage of this. In the two ways that we saw, we can either aim to attack the pawn immediately or first conquer the square in front of it. Usually, it's better to first conquer the square in front of it to not have to deal with any sacrifices or something like this. Now, granted, if you are a bit higher rated, your opponents will not just play a pawn move to weaken themselves like this, even though this might happen a little bit. Most likely, you will have to play some pawn moves of your own, like pawn breaks. Feel free to check out that video over here to see how to do that every time. But most likely, you will be the one that has to create weaknesses for your opponent. Now, this is much more difficult, but it can also happen. This is the point of, for example, our game example. In this position, basically, white did a minority attack. They played pawn to b4 at some point, and then pawn to b5, and then took b takes c6, forcing black to go b takes c6. That's how this structure came to be. And now we have the backwards pawn on c6 and the outpost on c5. So the way you would exploit this if this were a real game is just by starting to pile up pieces over here, not allowing them to get rid of their weakness by c5. So knight a4 is the first move, aiming to just go knight c5 or rook c1 or bishop b4, something like this. So get every single piece to control this to make sure you conquer that square. Once you do conquer that square, then you can move on to attacking the actual weakness behind it. I want to show you a quick example variation of how I expected this game to continue, just so if you're ever in a position similar to this, you get to see how this evolves until we're able to actually win this battle. So after knight to a4, let's say black plays h6 to be able to move the knight without losing the pawn. And we just continue piling up pieces. So rook fc1, bishop b4, something like this. Let's say bishop to b4. If they take, we just recapture, no problem. Let's say they play rook fc8. They have to add some more defenders here. We go bishop takes d6 to remove one of the defenders of this square, weakening that square. Rook fc1, adding more attackers. How would black try to, let's say they make knight d7 work, so they move the bishop out of the way to play knight d7 to have an additional defender here. So they're also trying to win the battle over this square so that it's not so weak. And they could possibly play c5 after that, trading their weak pawn for your healthy pawn, something like this. Let's say we play knight c5. They play knight to d7, trying to remove our blockade here. We take it because that's... actually, instead of taking it, probably it's better to just go rook ab1, get all the pieces to the game. This is also fine, though. Whatever they take with, I would go queen c5 next. So I'm not sure between these moves. It's not a big difference anyway. Rook ab1, let's say they take into us. We could just go queen takes. Again, never go pawn takes because that would change everything. Anytime you change the pawn structure, you change the whole of the weaknesses and outposts. You change the whole deal. So make sure to always capture on an outpost with a piece. Queen takes c5, and now let's say they take, you take back. Now it's very obvious and apparent that you have won this battle, and you can now switch your attention fully to just capturing this and piling up on it until it just falls. So for example, I would aim to play maybe rook c1, maybe get this bishop around first, bishop c2, bishop a4, and somehow I'm sure this will fall, or all of their pieces will be way too passive and weak, so I will be able to then win on the other side, perhaps. So something like, let's say bishop to d7, bishop c2, aiming for bishop a4. They get the king in, let's say, something like this. And I'm already, I could have also infiltrated with rook b7. I could go rook c1. White is in full control. And that was everything about pawn weaknesses and how to take advantage of them. Now we're going to move on to piece activity. But before we do, if you've learned something of value, if you feel like this video is useful for you, let me know down in the comments or by liking the video. Also, feel free to subscribe on my channel to see more stuff like this and to tell the YouTube algorithm that you enjoy chess improvement. Now, let's get on to piece activity. In piece activity here, we're going to first take a look at why it matters in the endgame, and then we're going to see how to use it in the middle game by improving pieces, trading pieces, how to positionally and strategically outplay your opponents. So if you have a piece activity advantage in the endgame, usually that's enough to win. So here we have a typical good knight versus bad bishop scenario. What makes this bishop bad? The fact that his pawns are on the same color and it's a purely defensive piece. Also, our pawns are on the opposite color, so this bishop can never attack them. In other words, it's only white wins or black somehow finds a draw. The way you would win this is by simply improving your position as much as possible, mainly your king. The king is the main actor of the endgame. So when we say piece activity, in the endgame, that includes the king. In the middle game, not so much. The king wants to be safe. So the way white wins this is probably g5 to be able to create this route for the king to infiltrate into the opponent's position. So I'm expecting black to play, let's say, bishop e7, we just go king f3. They go king g7, we go king g4. And already it's hard to find a move for black because their pieces are so tied down and defensive, while ours are aggressive, attacking, grabbing space, much better. So they probably have to just wait around. King f5 we play, and already I think white just wins, because if we go king g7 for black, our king gets to infiltrate into the opponent's position. If we go bishop f8, we just go g6, for example. If they take, we just take it back. And again, we're grabbing more and more space. Now we have to be a little bit careful and calculate variations, but I think knight to g5 with knight e6 should be good enough for the victory. For example, just to show a quick variation, after knight g5, if they don't want this to be checked, they would go back. We go knight e6, and now black could be tricky and play bishop e7 to avoid ours from getting further king infiltration. But when you have active pieces, you have many solutions. So, for example, knight c7 with knight e8 allows our king to get in while also protecting the g7 square. So, for example, king g7, knight e8 check, he goes back, we just go king e6. And now if they make a run for the pawn, our knight catches it in time. For example, e4 here, if they try to get with the pawn, knight f6, king g7, knight h5, and we get to catch the pawn, and our king will pick up the rest and promote our d-pawn. So they can't make a run for it. And if they don't, they have to play something passive. And always we're going to have some way to outplay them here, because their pieces are barely out of moves and we have many, many options. For example, here g7 should be good enough. And when they take it, we take this one instead. And now all of these are about to fall with a great endgame. So knight e4 is basically a pre-move. And from there, either this one falls or this one, and we're up a pawn, we're going to promote here. Now the question is, how do you get to such an endgame where you are clearly dominant and it's either you win or somehow your opponent holds a draw? Well, you have to be accurate in the middle game and recognize which pieces are good, which pieces are bad, to be able to transfer those good pieces in the endgame and hopefully keep your opponent's bad pieces on the board for the endgame. So we're going to talk about the middle game. Let's say you have a middle game like this, and fairly closed, and all the minor pieces are not doing anything. Everything here is blocked, so is everything here. And you have to master the art. This is very key for positional play. You have to master the art of improving pieces and trading pieces. These are giant chapters when it comes to positional play, but I'm going to do my best to explain it in very short, concise terms. So how would you improve these pieces? I have a whole video on that, especially which questions you need to ask yourself to properly improve your piece. But the questions are, number one, what's my worst piece? Let's say it's the bishop. Number two, where would I want it if I could place it anywhere on the board? In this particular position, I think the answer would be this diagonal, somewhere. A3, D6, doesn't matter. So for that reason, you will see, question number three is just how do you get there? Bishop C1, bishop A3. So this is how you would properly improve a piece. And then after this, let's say your opponent plays nothing. How would you do so for the knight? Well, by now, all that you're seeing is probably knight h4, but try and think about the best possible place on the board. That's why question number two is very, very important, because we're not looking at legal moves. That's very limiting and constraining. We're trying to find the best square on the board, and probably it's b4, because that allows us further infiltration into the queen side. How do we get to b4? Knight e1, knight c2, knight b4. And sure, that takes quite a few moves, but the position is completely closed, so you have all the time in the world. This is how you make your pieces better, by improving your pieces, but you can also make a difference in piece quality and piece activity by trading correctly. So here we have another position, which is about even, but black can make a strategically wonderful trade here by recognizing which of their pieces are good and bad, particularly the bishops. So here we have one good bishop, one bad bishop. The way you determine which bishop is good, which bishop is bad, is by looking at your own pawns. That's what it depends on. So here, our dark square bishop is our bad one because all of our pawns are on the same color. So this bishop is being significantly limited in its mobility, while the other one can freely move between these pawns, not blocked at all. So this is the one we want to trade. What is the one for the opponent? So this is their bad bishop, because their pawns are stuck on dark squares for the most part. And this is their good bishop because it can move freely between their pawns. So you can notice that it's opposite. Our bad one is their good one. Our good one is their bad one. That's not a coincidence. The reason why is because our pawns tend to be blocked, and when they are, then they tend to be on opposite colors. So if our pawns are on light squares, our light square bishop is bad. But that means that their pawns are on dark squares, so their light square bishop is good. So here we have to trade light square bishops. The move is bishop b5. And sure, they could trade into us and weaken our pawns slightly, but this gives us an open file, so it's not that bad. And we have other pieces protecting it, so the weakness of the double pawns doesn't really influence the position much. So now the position remains equal after this trade, but I can tell you from a human perspective, either black wins or it's a draw. Because for a human, it's much easier to play with a good bishop than a bad one. There are various plans here for black to improve the position. For example, they could play b4 to fix the a2 pawn in place, to not allow it to go up, because then it will get traded. So b4 is one idea. Another idea is rook to c4 to be able to double up, and if they take, we fix our doubled pawns. Another idea is to trade all the major pieces to go into a good bishop versus bad bishop endgame and try to outplay our opponent there, utilizing pawn breaks, utilizing the fact that their pawns are on dark squares forever, so we can attack them while they have to be purely defensive. There are many, many ideas to try and outplay the opponent, although on paper the position remains equal. And with that, we finished piece activity and the entirety of this video. Hopefully that was instructive, even though it was a lot of stuff, but this hasn't even scratched the surface of positional play. I just wanted to introduce main parts, and that way you can tell me what you want to learn more about specifically. Would you like me to dive deeper into weak squares, outposts? Would you like me to dive deeper into pawn weaknesses, or perhaps into piece activity, or king safety, which we haven't even talked about so far? Positional play is way too broad of a topic, but I hope I've been concise enough and informative, and you can use this in your games. Thank you very much for watching. This has been it for this video, and I hope you have a lovely week. Take it easy.